Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we are going to do this drawing of a cupcake. I just loved the pastel rainbowy icing and I thought it would be really fun to draw with these markers. I'm using the Artify set of 108 brush and chisel markers for this project today, and I'm sketching with a turquoise col erase pencil. Now the sketch isn't going to show up too much because it is that turquoise color. It's kind of a nice color to use when you're sketching because often the lines will not show up when you photograph or photocopy it. So my apologies for the really pale sketch, but I wanted to make sure that the lines were just going to kind of disappear in my finished artwork. I kind of gotten myself into a little bit of issue there doing the frosting. I was in a rush to draw with the markers, I think. I was in a rush to add the color that I could have taken a little more time making that icing sketch accurate. Now I flipped my sketchbook around upside down so that I could just work on the cupcake wrapper. It's got like the cupcake has a wrapper, but then it's like sitting on like a collar, like a cardboard collar, a little treat cup type thing. So I wanted to make sure that I had that a little bit more symmetrical. And here I'm just drawing in the scalloped edges. Now I tend to sketch pretty loosely in general, and when you're going to do marker art, it's really good if you start with a really strong, defined, accurate sketch because you don't have as much wiggle room as you work. Like if you're doing oil paints or acrylics or even watercolor for that matter, you can kind of mush things around and fudge things and fix them as you go. But with marker art, you're really kind of married to that sketch a little bit more. So my first tip for marker art would be get that sketch right the first time, spend a little more time on your sketch, and you'll have a much easier time when you go to color it in. One way that I get around the being a little sketchy with my markers is that I wait till the end to do fine lining, and that's when you go in with a black pen rather than sketching it with pencil, then do my inking and then do the marker work, because sometimes I don't want the fine line, so it just gives me a little more versatility. But other times I realize that I've made an error, and then I can go in with a fine liner, get my really defined outlines, and then I can go back in with a marker and kind of zhuzh it a little bit. So there's some tips there. But you know, I'm working in my sketchbook. This is just for me. It's not for a client or anything. I'm just having a good time. So you know, it is what it is. It's fun. It's fun art, not fine art, right? Now I have done a kind of a pale, warm, golden, creamy yellow for the base of the cake part, and then I added in some kind of like a warmer brown and just stippling for the texture, and then I'm going in with a darker brown and doing some shadow right underneath the icing and also at the edge of the cupcake cone or collar, between the wrapper and the cardboard, whatever that it's sitting in. And now I'm laying in some of the pastel tones, and I'm starting in with this really pale lavender. Now something that you're going to notice if you have these markers and you color in the swatch card is that, and this will go with whatever set you have that comes with its own swatch card, you're going to notice that your markers may look different on the paper that you usually use versus the pre-printed swatch card that you can color in, or even if you had, especially if you had like a pre-printed swatch card that had all the colors pre-printed. You really want to test the markers on the paper that you typically use. You can make a swatch with the paper you usually use, or you could just kind of test it out on the side or on another page. But don't be surprised if you have a bit of a shift, if either the markers look lighter or darker on the paper that you're using. I was really expecting my markers to look lighter on my marker paper versus the swatch card, because the swatch card almost felt like a hot press watercolor paper. It had a little bit of tooth to it and it was quite thick. So I thought for sure that was going to absorb more ink and give me a darker look than what I'd get on my marker paper. But the opposite was true. Actually, on this marker paper, which is the Ohuhu marker pad, the markers appeared a bit darker than what it looked like on my swatch. So just kind of keep that in mind. You can either re-swatch it on the paper that you usually use, or you can just make a note of it, and then it'll just help you when you choose colors. I did find the caps to be pretty accurate on these markers, which was really handy because I could also just look at a marker and grab what I wanted. I'm going in with some grays to build up some of the shadows between the layers of frosting, and I'm just trying to integrate them a little bit with some really, really pale blue. I've added in some yellow and some blue as well, and I'm going in and erasing any leftover pencil marks that might still be hanging around. I felt like I had a kind of a rough edge, and I just wanted to see what was there without the pencil lines in the way. Now, make sure your marker ink is dry before you do this so you don't end up getting some like smearing or anything. It really shouldn't happen, but some papers take longer to dry than others, especially if they tend to be a little thicker because they're going to absorb more ink. Now, when I need a really sharp edge, a lot of times I'll use the chisel tip end of the marker because it's got a firmer straight edge and it's just easier to do a straight line, but it's harder to feather out and get those blends with that end. So I encourage you to get to know both ends of the marker and see what works best for you. I actually really like using a chisel tip marker. If I'm using a marker that's got a bullet and a chisel tip, I probably use the chisel tip 75% of the time and then the bullet tip for details. So use what you have. It's the same ink in all these different markers. The bullet tip markers generally are less expensive because the nibs cost less. It's the brush nib that usually brings up the price of a marker. Now, these markers are pretty affordable. I think they clock in at about 55 cents a marker, so certainly not bad. They're about the same price as the bullet chisel tip, but they are not a Copic equivalent brush tip. They are they're not bad. They're more like the Ohuhu brush tips than the Copics, but still, I think it's a pretty good buy for the price. So now I'm going over with the light blue, kind of tealy aqua blue color. I'm going over my gingham stripes, and I also just use kind of like a flicking feathering technique for that, so I can almost get a gingham, you know how gingham fabric looks where it's woven? That's kind of what I was going for there. Even though it's cardboard, it's paper, I thought that would be a real fun effect to get. And I'm going in with a stronger yellow this time and adding in the more intense tones of yellow. Now, a lot of times with markers, you'll end up doing a lot of layers to get a more rich look or a more complex design, or maybe just to adjust your tones because your markers generally dry a little bit lighter. When that paper's wet and you've got fresh ink down, it's going to look darker, and it can kind of worry you a bit. And when you're looking at that and you're like, oh, I wanted pastel and that's looking pretty dark, it usually will mellow out. So don't necessarily worry when that happens. Just keep on going, and remember, values are relative. So if something does come out a little darker than what you want, just make sure that you make the other values around it relative to that. So if your lightest tone came out just a smidgen darker than you wanted, then just do your other tones a little bit darker too to correspond with that. And you can always go in with a colored pencil or another opaque medium such as a pastel pencil if your paper's toothy enough, that is. Colored pencil is fine on this marker pad. That's why I really like it, because I can add the colored pencil after. And you can bring out brighter tones that way and bring out more body to the color, because alcohol markers and dye-based markers, those are probably the most transparent medium you are going to find. More transparent than watercolor. They're absolutely crystal clear. So yeah, you might need to flesh out some colors sometimes to get like the textures and the body that you want. Now I'm going in with a couple shades of purple, and I'm adding shading and depth into the purple icing. I do like that there are some really pale purples in this set because it makes blending them out much easier. Purples are a really tough color to blend. I also find that reds and pinks can be really tough to blend, so those, for whatever, I think it's the red combination or the violet combination in the ink that makes it a little trickier. So you want to make sure you have those closer shades handy. And I just go ahead and uncap both of them and work them back and forth so they don't set into the paper before I get a chance to blend them out. Because you need that ink wet to really get a good blend, especially with a tricky color like purple. Sometimes blues can be a bit challenging to blend as well. Just make sure you've got colors that are close to each other in value, meaning how light or how dark they are, and they should blend fairly well for you. I'm doing the same thing with the pink here. Like I mentioned, pink can also be a troublemaker when it comes to blending. So having those two uncapped tones of pink ready to go will make it a lot easier for you as you are embarking on your marker journey. I think it's a lot of fun to work with markers. It does take me quite a bit longer than if I was going to do it in like watercolor per se, but there's just something really satisfying and fun about uncapping that marker and, you know, putting color right on the paper. I'm sure it harkens back to our carefree days of old when we were children and we would get that box of Crayola markers and we would just, you know, play with them. I'm sure that's where that comes from. So now I'm getting into the stage where I want to do fine lining here, and I'm using a Biennial fine liner. This is the I think it's 0.005 or 0.05. I think it's a 0.005. It's a very fine tip, and I typically don't go any finer than this, and I rarely use a pen this fine, but I didn't want my outlines to be heavy. I wanted them very delicate and light because this is such a pastel piece. I did want to get some more detail though. I feel like I lost a lot of the crispness when I was coloring with the markers and blending with them. So by going in with a fine liner, you can kind of pull back those details that you might have lost. And because I did not start with the strongest sketch on the icing, because I was anxious to get in there and paint in color, so do as I say, don't do as I do, guys. Because I was so anxious to get in there in color, I did not spend as much time as I should have developing the folds and ruffles in the icing. Now I'm going in with a white Prismacolor pencil. You can see how short that is. I have so many of these short little white pencils. I need to find my pencil extender. But if you could only have one pencil in your stash, grab a white Prismacolor. That will benefit you so much when you're doing marker art because it can just bring out those highlights. It has an opacity to it that's not so opaque like a paint pen or a white gel pen. It's a little bit softer, but it just does a wonderful thing about giving your pictures more body, and it brings out highlights. It's just a really nice tool to have if you've got a set of markers. And if you've got a small set of markers and you want to increase their versatility, I highly recommend just getting a set of colored pencils. They don't have to be the most expensive set of pencils. They do not have to be the largest set of pencils. A set of 36 Prismacolors would be everything you really need to augment your colored pencils. I would recommend something like that, or at the very least, a nice white Prismacolor pencil for bringing out those highlights. I'm even going in with this kind of cloud blue color and bringing in a little bit more of the soft shadow onto the front of the wrapper that I could see in my reference. And I'm going in with a little bit of like kind of a dull brown to bring in some of the shadow that's around the, like on the cake and on the cake wrapper, just to give a little more depth and definition between that and the pastel gingham collar that's around the cupcake. Now you could play with a drawing like this all day. I love to do the colored pencil over the top of the paper. If you think you like that technique and you want to do the colored pencil rather over your paper, I suggest you choose a marker paper that's not too slick. A lot of marker papers that are thin are super slick. Now those are designed so that you don't waste your ink, but they can make it really difficult for any media to stick on top. I like the Ohuhu marker pad. I also like Bristol board, and there's a cardstock by Paper Tray Ink that I really like for this technique. So just make sure it's got a little bit of something that the pencil can grab onto, and that's pretty much gonna do it. I hope you enjoyed this project today. Thank you so much for watching. Please give me a thumbs up if you liked it. And until next time, happy crafting.